Welcome to the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Dame, holistic nutrition coach and speaker. Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome everyone to another incredible episode here on the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm very excited to be welcoming our special guest today. Dr. Richard Jacoby is here. And before we dive in with him, for those who aren't familiar, Dr. Jacoby is one of the leading experts in podiatry in the United States. He received his postgraduate education at Villanova University in Pennsylvania and attended medical school at Pennsylvania College of Pediatric Medicine, graduating in 1969. Dr. Jacoby has won the Phoenix Magazine Top Docs Award on 4 different occasions, 2003, 2005, 2008, and 2010. What an honor. And he is actually the co-author of a book that you may have heard of called Sugar Crush: How to Reduce Inflammation, Reverse Nerve Damage, and Reclaim Good Health. Dr. Jacoby is a past president of the Arizona Podiatry Association, as well as the Association of Extremity Nerve Surgeon. He specializes in the treatment of peripheral neuropathy and has been in practice since 1970. So we're going to be having an incredible conversation today. Welcome to the show, Dr. Jacoby. I'm so grateful to have you here.
I'm excited to talk to your audience. I think I can give them a new perspective on what sugar does to nerves.
Yes. Yeah. And this is an angle we haven't really tackled here on the podcast yet. So I'm personally very much looking forward to learning from you. I'm very fascinated about nerve regeneration as well. And, the holistic modalities that we might be able to bring in, or obviously the traditional medical modalities that might support. So before we dive into that, I know I just read your bio and shared a little bit about you, but I'd love for you to share with our audience a little more of your backstory. What is it that really started you into medicine and into the work that you started doing, and obviously into what you're doing today?
Well, it's a long story. I'll try to shorten it up. It goes back to Philadelphia, 50 years ago or so. I was in undergraduate school. I was just graduating. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I went to a university in Pennsylvania called Villanova for chemistry. And then I got accepted to the Pennsylvania College of Podiatric Medicine in Philadelphia. I studied there for 40 years. And in those days, we did work-study programs, which allowed us to work in a laboratory. And I was assigned to Michael Scheff's laboratory in Philadelphia called the Ben Franklin Clinic. And he was studying PKU, which is a birth defect, phenylketonuria. And that stains the basal ganglia in the brain. So I fed the rats, my little friends, little furry friends, and I gave them different chows. Chows meaning food. Now, thinking back, we were feeding them chow that had more sugar content and chows that didn't, to look at their amino acids underneath what we call electrophoresis. And that's taking their brains, rendering them, and looking at their brain material and running electricity through it to see what the different amino acids were. The answer we did not know at that time, but now it's been proven that it's BH4. It's a biochemical cofactor in the conversion of L-arginine to nitric oxide. And that has everything to do with what we're going to talk about today. So I moved to Phoenix area, settled in Scottsdale, did general podiatric surgery, which involves really orthopedic types of procedures, ankle fractures, things of that nature. And then I was introduced to a concept by Dr. Lee Dellon from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. He was giving a lecture and he said to me, "Why do you podiatrists cut the nerve out of the foot?" And I said, "Well, that's what we were taught. And that's what everybody's taught." But he had a different viewpoint because he had different training. He was a plastic surgeon by training. And back in his day, if you saw a nerve problem, you normally sent them to a plastic surgeon who specialized in hand surgery. That's how rare it was. So he was that guy at Johns Hopkins. One day in the 80s, a patient said to him, "Dr. Dellon, you fixed my carpal tunnel and my ulnar tunnel. Why don't you fix my legs. And he said, that's a different disease. She was a diabetic. She had diabetic polyneuropathy, meaning multiple nerves injured in the leg due to this process. Well, he went to the laboratory and looked at the different biochemical markers, and I'll get into the chemistry in a second, but he looked at that and he said, well, there are a homologous, that's a Latin word meaning like for like, but similar, but somewhat different in function. So the carpal tunnel and the tarsal tunnel. He found these tunnels. I shouldn't say he found them. He discovered their function because they've been there. Forever. But what did they do, and how did they function, and how did they malfunction? So Dr. Dellon took the concept of decompressing this nerve, the median nerve, applied a concept which was called the double crush theory. I don't know if you want me to get deep into that, but it's somewhat relevant. It is very relevant to his thought process. So there was a group of doctors at Harvard, wrote an article in 1963, Upton and McComas, and they noticed that people had carpal tunnel, which is extremely rare, by the way, in the 60s. 12 cases reported in the literature. That's it.
Wow.
12. And they noticed that carpal tunnel, when they did a release here, they had a relief at the brachial plexus and vice versa. But they also noticed that 16% of the patients also had diabetes. So they called that a additional crush by sugar. And that's why the name of my book is Sugar Crush.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
so that...
Wow. So much to dive into here for sure. And you just mentioned the book. So I wanted to jump in and ask a little bit about the book for those who haven't read it. It sounds like you've kind of already shared a little bit of this, like your inspiration behind writing Sugar Crush. And maybe now is a good segue to actually get into that conversation around like how is sugar and this processed food revolution that we live in that is, what is that actually doing to our nerves? For those of us who aren't super sciencey, maybe you can keep it kind of, do your best to explain.
Well, I think it is an advantage not to be super scientific, because after I explain it to you, this is so simple, you're going to go, oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, why don't the scientists get that? Well,
That's a great question.
That's a real good question. And I think the answer lies in the fact that medical doctors, neurologists, who are not surgeons, are dominating the conversation. Uh-huh. And they are dominated by drugs. They're looking for a drug that will mitigate the effects of inflammation caused by sugar. That's what they do. If you ask them that question, they will categorically say, there's no cure. Take this, take that, drugs that don't work, drugs that have tremendous amount of side effects and cannot, and I'm going to repeat this, they cannot solve the problem. They may make you feel better while you're slowly dying. So with that in mind, and thinking about Dr. Dellon, who's the world's leading authority on peripheral nerve surgeons, by the way, absolutely the number one, Johns Hopkins. So a couple of years after bringing that concept back to Scottsdale, I had developed the wound care center for our hospital, and I brought that concept back, and they were all like, oh my God, what are you doing? You don't operate on diabetics. This is dangerous. This is all that nonsense. Well, I said, you have to read Dr. Dellon's book. Well, they're medical doctors. This is a surgical solution. And I said, you have to have his lens. You have to put his lens on, because we did the surgery and do the surgery with 3.5 magnification, okay? Now, I said to Dr. Dellon, I think there's more to your theory. I read a great article, which your audience should read. It's called The Uber Marker, written by Dr. John Cook at Stanford at the time in the year 2004. And I texted him, I said, Dr. Dellon has a theory. I think your theory with nitric oxide also fits that theory. He called me on the phone 2 hours later. He said, I love your idea. Come up to Stanford, work with me, which I did. I used his molecule, and we'll get all into the weeds of all that stuff. And I figured out that his molecule, asymmetric dimethylarginine, is, and I want to emphasize that, is the first molecule that blocks the nitric oxide pathway. And that's how this whole thing evolves. But I said to Dr. Cook said to me, if you want to look up the article, his name is John Cook with an E. And he said to me, quit your practice and work with me full time at Stanford. I said, well, it's going to take 15 years to figure this out, which it did. I said, I'll write a book called Sugar Crush and let real scientists figure it out. And they did. And he called me a couple of years ago. He said, you're absolutely right. And I said, I know I was right. Because I have a background in this. I understand this. I see this every day. And I said, I also told you it would take 15 years, which it did, just to be smart.
Things don't move fast in the medical world, do they?
No, they don't. Meanwhile, there's 1.5 million amputations every year in the world, 150,000 in the United States. I don't know what it is in Canada where you're at.
Yeah.
But we're going to kind of bring Canadian thought process in here. By the way, Susan McKenna, who is a peripheral nerve surgeon, co-wrote the book with Dr. Dellon from McGill University. So a shout out to Susan.
Great. Yeah.
But,
So what you're saying here, just, bringing this in for my audience and kind of knowing how their brains think, what you're saying here, I mean, we're talking a lot about even like diabetic nerve damage and just nerve damage in general, but obviously the inflammation that is caused by our overconsumption of sugar and our blood sugar regulation issues and our metabolism issues causing this damage that what you're saying is doesn't actually have to be amputated. I know we hear that all the time, right? Is diabetics losing their legs and having to have limbs cut off. But what you're saying is there's an alternative way here that can be done surgically. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's amazing. Like I just wanted to pull that out and this is incredible when people like you and doctors like you will start looking for alternative ways of understanding, especially in the medical field. And I can imagine how difficult that is going against the grain. I know a little bit about big pharma and all the people involved in a system that is clearly not working, clearly not helping us get any healthier. So just a huge, celebration for you being willing to look different in different angles and to do different research and think differently outside the box. And we need more of that.
Well, you just said something very profound. You said going against the grain. That's sugar.
Yeah.
Okay? And we love sugar. You, I, everybody, animals we work on, everybody likes sugar. It's a poison. And I'll get it exactly why and how. So let's start with the biochemistry. So I try not to put everybody to sleep. It's well documented in my book, but just so simple. I mean, it is so simple. It's going to amaze you. So the first pathway is called the polyol pathway. What that means is when sugar gets inside the nerve, can you see the nerve or this cable?
Yep.
That I'm okay? When sugar gets inside that nerve, it goes through a big chemical pathway. We don't have to get into that, but it breaks down to sorbitol, which is an alcohol sugar. Mm-hmm. Alcohol brings water into the nerve. It swells the nerve, makes it bigger. Okay. Point number 2, the Maillard reaction. Sugar plus a protein like collagen or the soft tissue around the nerve, like shrink wrap, it squeezes the nerve. So you have a nerve that's swelling, a wrapping that is compressing, in a tunnel, innervating a muscle that has a function. It's that simple. It's sugar. Which sugar? Well, glucose and also fructose and a couple other ones, but the main characters are those two. Now, why do we have an epidemic? Well, let's go back to 1984, Dr. Dellon. So I just told you 1.5 million amputations every year. So we're talking almost 50 years or 40 years, right? So 40 times a million and a half, what's that, 60 million legs lost? While
Wow.
we're having this discussion,
Wow.
I know the answer to this question. Dr. Dellon knows the answer to that question. Dr. Cook at Stanford knows that answer. Dr. Hamlin at Harvard knows that answer. As a matter of fact, all the top scientists in the world know the answer to this, but why can't they put this together? So let me show you what I found at Mayo. So I was at Mayo.
Yeah, and we'll describe this a little bit for those who are just listening to the audio version, because I know you showed me this photo before we started, and it's great.
So I'm at Mayo Clinic in 2011, and I'm looking through a microscope. See that little dot there of light?
Yeah,
That's
bright white light.
That's what I'm looking at through the microscope with about 20 to 1 magnification.
Yeah.
Do you see what I see?
No, I just see a bright white light.
Ah, perfect. Now I'm going to show you what I see. That's my little furry friend. That's unbelievable. See the brown, that's his fur, and that's his sciatic nerve and neurovascular bundle.
So that's the nerve that's going across that little gray-green spot.
Right.
That's the nerve we can see there.
Right. And I would practice on that and suture those ends together under that magnification. I could not see the needle. And when my professor handed me the needle, and he does this as a joke, he says, they're on your table. And everybody says, where? Well, pick up the box, put it under the microscope, and you will see the needle. Wow. Well, I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? So this is fundamental to this conversation. Unless you read what Dr. Dellon has talked about, put Dr. Cook's biochemistry into the equation, and then put the microscope on and put the loops on, and you will see what I see. And I will challenge any, and including a very famous Canadian neurologist, and this is a funny name, but you guys are Canadian, just do things a little bit different.
We do.
And you do, and he spells his last name, D-Y-C-K, but he pronounces it Dick. In our country, that's a funny thing. And
that's very Dutch.
Is that very Dutch? Yes.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and his first name is Peter, so his name is Peter Dick. He's probably the most famous neurologist of all time at Mayo Clinic, Rochester, but he is a Canadian. He wrote a great textbook on this subject, but he also vilified and refused to talk to Dr. Dellon. Refused. Dr. Dellon went to him years ago to discuss this. He would not see him. That's how arrogant he is. And that arrogance has produced 60 million amputations since that conversation should have taken place.
Wow. Yeah,
That's
just closed-mindedness, right? Like there's no other way. You know, that's a dangerous place to be, especially in medicine.
But he's the smartest guy in the field.
Yeah.
Now, why couldn't he see that? Because he couldn't see what I saw. Yet he's at Mayo Clinic, but he's not a surgeon. So even if he read the book, which he didn't, and looked under the microscope, which he didn't, he couldn't do anything about it, even though he's the smartest neurologist in the world. He only has a skill set of writing for a prescription. And he's well rewarded for that with his research, because all big pharma loves to go to them at Mayo. Here's my new molecule. Can you monetize it with a drug? And the answer is, of course we can. And that's why you have those institutions that are enormous. And Stanford, Johns Hopkins, all of them are similar. They're looking for a drug to solve this problem. It cannot be solved by that method, but it certainly can monetize these diseases.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important point for people to understand. And I know when I first really started wrapping my head around that, I mean, really sadly understanding the world that we live in and the capitalist society, and a lot of these universities that are touted as being, the leaders in research, science research, and all sorts of other research, right, are ultimately, in the pockets and working on things for big pharma, right? And understanding that, there's almost no such thing as an unbiased study, and really starting to question and think about. I want everybody listening, right, to be thinking when we hear rumors or we see an article online, right, we just take it as truth because it came from Stanford or it came from Mayo. But who was behind it, right? Like, and what was their motive, right? Was it to actually find a root cause solution, or is it another Band-Aid approach, like another medication, right? And we know that's unfortunately a big part of our quote unquote health industry, right? In creating these things, as opposed to root cause, which we're all about here on the podcast. So like what you're sharing here is fantastic. And I can't help but think, there's even a step before that. I'm going to be, just repeating myself over and over again on the podcast, right? Before we have to get to that nerve damage, we can do things, right? The real solution here would be to not be overdosing on sugar and processed foods and stress, and all the other things that play into what's causing ultimately a lot of this nerve damage. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
my path, you asked me how I got into this. Well, that was with my little furry friends, the rats in Philadelphia. And that has always been in the back of my mind. I did not know the answer to the question for sure. But in 1981, I was asked by the Surgeon General of Taiwan to go there to figure out why they had diabetes. And I was there on and off for 3 years. And his name is Luke Chu, C-H-U. And he's a medical doctor, but he has a PhD in pharmacology. Now, he was enamored by Western medicine. So I get there in 81. Of course, I said to Dr. Chu, I said, what's the word for, in your language, Mandarin, sugar? And he said, diabetes. And he said, well, it's diabetes. I said, no, don't you have a local word? Well, not really. Well, the answer is because we really didn't have diabetes until you got the Western diet. First fast food restaurant in 1979. I'm there in 81. He's saying we got an epidemic. I actually didn't see that many diabetics, but to them it was unique. The rich people in Taiwan were going to our Western restaurants to eat the poison, and they were getting fat and they were getting sick, just like everybody else in the Western Europe. So if you go back to the beginning of all this with Christopher Columbus, and I realize you're Canadian. What's your feeling on Chris? Did he discover Canada? I don't think so.
You know what? I don't know. I haven't spent a lot of time really like pondering that one myself.
Well, I've read a lot of things about that. Columbus was not the first. For Canada and New Brunswick, it was probably Leif Erikson, the Vikings. But Christopher Columbus went to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain and said, I got a deal for you. I have the maps from the Portuguese, and I can find the riches of gold and silver and sugar. And if you loan me the money, I'll go there. And he did in the West Indies, and you know the rest of the story. So sugar cane and the farming of that and sending it back to Europe, that was the beginning of the United States of America, and probably Canada as well, and South America. So that's where the money came from. Yeah. So the human genome really never was confronted with that much sugar. So in the 1400s, when Columbus did that, it came back to Europe very slowly, but by 1600s, it was an epidemic in Europe. So who ate the sugar? The rich, because it was about $1,000 a pound in our currency at that time. So they had like cocaine parties, which it is very similar to cocaine. It's addicting, it makes you feel good, but it kills you with multiple different diseases, where cocaine doesn't. It may ruin your life. If you become a drug dealer, well, that's another story, but it doesn't kill you with the use of it. But sugar does. Sugar is legal, cocaine is illegal. Recent article so anyway, so that's what happened. So who got the disease? The rich. Who had the doctors? Well, that was the rich. And that's when it started. Thomas Willis in the 1600s, he was the first, quote unquote, the godfather of the concept of circle wills. It's named for him in Gray's Anatomy. So he started looking at these things. He actually saw the effects of sugar. He didn't know what this cause and effect was, but he was seeing the clinical implications of that. And then we went to France and Germany and those places. And then, like Charcot, he started to look at this. He was very close to understanding it, but he didn't have the chemistry. He didn't have the lens to look through that Dellon had. But he did make some good observations, like MS, multiple areas of sclerosis in the brain and the spinal cord. And that just means he saw the white spots, the tangles, the tau formations. Well, that is an effect. It's not a disease. It's an effect of sugar, in my opinion. And what I did in my studies, I put all these diseases into the same process. They do demyelinate the nerve, yes, but I just explained to you how compression causes that. So, let's start with atherosclerosis, another word with the word sclerosis, meaning hardening of. Yeah. And he was talking about atherosclerosis, and I think he was in Vienna at the time in the 1860s. He said, what's this gunk? Well, Greek for gunk is athero. Hardened gunk. How's that a diagnosis? That's what you're observing inside the artery. So let's segue to Dr. Cook at Stanford. First question I asked him, because I always thought that was an absolute fraud, statin drugs and the rest of it. But he's the world's leading authority, so I didn't want to, say the wrong thing. So I said, Dr. Cook, could you help me understand this cholesterol hypothesis? And his answer is very clear. The lining of the blood vessels, called the endothelium, it's like Teflon, smooth, silky. When you eat sugar, it makes it like Velcro. So cholesterol is a signaling molecule, goes to the area of inflammation, puts down the plaque, which is really cholesterol. And every time you eat sugar, it gets wider and wider and blocks your arteries. That's the answer to atherosclerosis. So, question, why are we giving people statin drugs? To lower cholesterol. That's a signaling molecule. Without that, you would die. Yeah. And the answer? Money. That's $1 trillion in U.S. Yeah. I have friends in Canada. You guys always say, no, is that Canadian dollars? No. Yours is like six.
Are you familiar with Dr. Lustig, Robert Lustig?
Oh, absolutely.
And his work? Yeah, I had him on the show a few months back, and we had a deep dive conversation about cholesterol, and it was quite controversial, right? But it's a no-brainer when we start looking at it and we see, I mean, even my mom just had heart surgery recently, and I'm so grateful that she was like, no, I'm not getting on these drugs. She doesn't actually need them, but it's such a fascinating piece to really understand about the world that we live in and the society.
Well, let's take Dr. Lustig. He's a pediatric endocrinologist. Yeah. So he comes from a different point of view than I do. Yeah. He does admit it's sugar. It's not cholesterol, right? He knows his biochemistry.
Or fat. Like, let's just throw that word in here, right? Because that's what we're all working on shifting out of. And I know you agree with that too, right? Yeah. When are we going to stop blaming fat, right? And start understanding that it's sugar that's causing some damage.
Exactly. So he wrote Fat Chance. Yeah. And Nina Teicholz, I don't know if you know her name, but she wrote The Big Fat Surprise. Mm-hmm. Her book is absolutely well done because she's an investigative reporter. So she's like you, questioning what have we been taught and unraveling the mystery. So when you take Lustig, who confirms what she thought scientifically, now he's well-researched individual. Now, but if we were talking, and this is where it would be interesting because he's not going to have the lens. He's going to go, what are you talking about? Yeah. And even if he did have the lens, he doesn't have the skill set to unglue this problem, which is the name
Yeah.
of my new book.
Specifically around nerves. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you something here, because I know that this is something that you talk about, is this link between Alzheimer's, right? Let's bring in Alzheimer's here. Alzheimer's
let's go
and
with that.
diabetic neuropathy, right? This nerve damage that's, obviously as diabetes. We now know Alzheimer's being called diabetes 3. What is the link there, and how are you seeing that from your lens and from the nerves that obviously so intimately?
Wow, what a segue.
Yeah.
We didn't rehearse this. This is perfect. So that's Dr. Perlmutter,
Yeah.
who's a neurologist, famous, who endorsed my book. Interesting, huh? I never spoke to him, and I have never spoken to him. I assume, and I don't know the answer to this question, this is a shout out to Dr. Perlmutter. You endorsed my book. I assume you read it, but that may not be true. I don't know. But he calls Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes.
Yeah.
And I would have this conversation with him if that ever happens. Well, he is saying that sugar is involved in the process. So we would agree on that. I think his friend, Richard Johnson, who also wrote a book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. I don't know if you read that one about high fructose corn syrup. He's a friend of his. He also, I had the book right here. He wrote not the foreword. He's on the front of this kind of interesting puzzle. So, foreword by foreword by David Perlmutter, #1 New York Times bestseller.
Yeah.
He endorsed that book. He endorsed my book.
Yeah.
But we have never discussed this. Now, I did discuss it with Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson also, by the way, it's a great book. If you want to know the history of sugar and lots of facts that I learned.
Which book specifically are you talking about?
Nature Wants Us to Be Fat.
Okay. Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. Okay. Can look that up.
Richard Johnson. So let's put fructose, Perlmutter, type 3 diabetes, Alzheimer's. Okay?
Yeah.
So, Alzheimer's, this is a guy just like Vercal looking at atherosclerosis or any other Bell's palsy. They're just people, happen to be doctors, noticing a process. So in medicine, you get your name on that. That makes you very famous. Okay? Like, hey, I see that it's raining outside. Well, you're the first guy to say that. Name it rain. Oh, well, you become the celebrity. That's what they did. So, Dr. Alzheimer, early 1900s, notices a patient who can't, I don't know if they couldn't find their keys. Yeah, early 1900s. Maybe the first guy who forgot where his keys were.
Okay. Yeah.
Look, where are my keys? So he losing his memory. So now this is in contradistinction to what Perlmutter would say, or Johnson would say, or Lustig would say, but this is how I would say it. And we're agreeing from a different point of view.
I think that's important to have different points of view, right? And different conversations around this.
Right. Now, and I'm sure they would all say, well, what is a podiatrist doing in this conversation on Alzheimer's, which is a brain problem? A fair question. And I also asked that of myself. But I trained with Dellon, a plastic surgeon. I trained with Cook, a cardiologist. I trained with Hamlin, who's a chemist at Harvard. Dr. Paul, another chemist. I mean, I've trained with lots and lots of people. Dr. Johansson, who's an anthropologist. I put all this together. I've never had that conversation, and this is a great point. I want to see if I can make this point very clear. Alzheimer's first symptom is a loss of smell. Did he discuss that, Dr. Lustig, or did you discuss this?
No, we didn't talk about Alzheimer's specifically. Yeah.
Okay. Loss of smell. What nerve is that? The olfactory nerve. I'll repeat that. It's the olfactory nerve. What nerve is this? The median nerve. What nerve is down here? The common perineal, deep perineal, posterior tibial. I can name them all.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. I just named them. But a nerve is a nerve is a nerve. Sugar is sugar is sugar. Chemistry is chemistry is chemistry. They affect every nerve. So let's go to Alzheimer's, first sense of smell. Where does that process in the brain? The hippocampus is the answer. There's three main things that hippocampus does. And it's called hippocampus because it looks like a seahorse, very small processing area, but very important. So first is loss of smell, then loss of memory, long term. And the third thing is the addiction center, like cocaine, sugar, whatever. Now, we would all agree sugar is type 3 diabetes. But if you look through my lens and you looked at the vagus nerve, the median nerve, this nerve and that nerve, oculomotor nerve, every nerve, what are we going to have? 7,000 type diabetes? No. I would contend we have one type, sugar, period. That's what it means. Diabetes mellitus, siphoning sugar water out of your body. That's what the word means. And did you discuss epigenetics with Dr. Lustig?
No, but I've had that conversation with others on the show.
Okay.
Yeah,
so why does one person get Alzheimer's and another person gets diabetic neuropathy? Epigenetics for your audience. Epi meaning above. So you and I have the same genes. We're human. We have alleles, which are groups of genes that you eat sugar, you get one itis. I eat sugar, I get another itis. That's all it means. So back to even type 1 diabetes. Human beings could not live unless they could process sugar. Mm-hmm. So when a child is born and has all these alleles, it's going to die almost at childbirth. But with the invention of insulin, that saved these kids. So the ones who were really affected by sugar that had massive amounts of alleles, in contrast, and I always say it this way, to the little old lady, I don't know why it has to be a little old lady, but it sounds real. And she's sitting on her porch in Vancouver, smoking her Camels, drinking her bourbon. She's 94, and she said, "What's the problem?" That's the bell-shaped curve. She has no alleles.
Yeah.
She can do what she wants. But then people say, well, look, she lived. Yeah, but you didn't ask the real question. All her friends are dead from the same process. She didn't have the gene. That's epigenetics. Yeah. So when you tie epigenetics, and I'll kind of morph over to Dr. Johansson, who's an anthropologist, the most famous anthropologist, and I know him well. And I studied with him and his group at Arizona State University, where his Institute for Human Origins is located. And they have done a lot of great things, but he was the discoverer of Lucy. Does your audience know Lucy? Lucy's supposedly the first primate. Right. So 3.2 million years ago. And she morphed over by changing her body physiology, which we call morphology, from a plant-based diet to a fat-based diet. And she became, instead of an ape, a human hybrid. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy about Darwin and Lamarck and all the guys and girls that are in that theory, but just take that for what it is. Human beings are carnivores. That's it. You may know Chafee, Chafee, the neurosurgeon out of Australia, carnivore diet. Dr. Baker, carnivore diet.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, actually, I want to ask you, sorry to interrupt, but, just keeping an eye on, obviously wanting to be respectful of your time, I want to ask you this because you just brought this up, talking about carnivore. I'm curious, what do you see from an actual nerve perspective in your lens? Have you been able to really see the difference between, say, plant-based vegan diet bodies and people who are eating that high protein, high fat, carnivore diet. What do you see? What are the actual differences that like you've seen in your research? Because I even know, for example, like my dad, who's probably not even listening to this, he's been vegan for many years and he's having some major nerve issues in his legs and and really struggling with he's found no solution as to what it is. And I like in the back of my mind, gently being like, perhaps there's something going on here with your high carbohydrate and low fat diet that is maybe contributing to that. So curious, like what you see there for anyone listening who might be in that struggle too.
Tell the audience we did not rehearse this.
No, we did not.
This is amazing because that's a perfect segue to that answer to that question. Carnivores, meat eaters, they get B12, essential.
Yeah.
Herbivores, vegetarians do not. So, but
they get it from a supplement, right? That would be their argument, right?
Well,
I take supplements. I take my B12 shots or.
Yeah, but in the natural setting, they didn't have a pharmacy or the internet to get it from.
Totally.
So we have to look at that very carefully. But let's go back to anthropology because I asked that question multiple times in multiple different ways. So hunter-gatherers. Yes, males need to hunt meat. B12, essential. Women, just imagine 100,000 years ago, you crawled out of the cave. The woman said, let's call him George. George, get your ass out of the cave. We need food.
Yeah.
Okay? She's in the cave with God knows how many kids she's got to feed. So she gathers roots, herbs, whatever, to feed these kids until he comes back, hopefully, with the food, which is meat. So women, yes, they can survive more on that than men. I think it's deadly for men not to eat meat.
Yeah.
Okay, B12. So that segues right into the biochemical answer. And the answer is back to my original study with Dr. Sheff. That was in the 60s. I'm old. Anyway, Jesus.
Or wise.
I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And so that BH4, tetrahydrobiopterin, which is the chemical name, what is that? It's magic. BH4. It's B6, B12, folic acid, and vitamin C. You need that to convert to nitric oxide. So this kind of explains the dichotomy between males and females because that's a coenzyme in every chemical reaction in the cell. Well, I said B6, B12, that's from meat. But folic acid, which is really from leaves, right? That's where the word comes from, foliage, folic acid, and vitamin C. Wow, we got a real interesting equation here. So vitamin C, by the way, human beings cannot make vitamin C. I don't know if you know that. Mm-hmm. Every other species can, except maybe the bat and a guinea pig. I don't know why this is, but 220,000 years ago, now we're getting into another science to support what I'm saying, actually. 220,000 years ago, there was a mutation on chromosome 2, and there was another one, chromosome 7, but we'll talk about 2. So it's like the gene was spliced. That gene is still there. GLU is what it's called, but it doesn't function. So this is really technical, but really important. Glucose and vitamin C are only 2 carbons different. You make your vitamin C out of glucose. We can't. We have to get it exogenously. So this goes to that carnivore, herbivore diet. You really do need some green vegetables in your diet to make the best conversion. And the vitamin C, which we all think, because we've been dumbed down to this one, drink your orange juice, eat your fruit, you'll get your vitamin C. But they forgot to tell you, and I'm going to remind you of that. Linus Pauling talked about this, but he did not know the answer to this question in the early 70s when he wrote his papers. The vitamin, it's called actually the ascorbate competition theory. And ascorbate, Latin for sugar, or for scurvy. Scurvy meaning you have vitamin C. If you don't have vitamin C, you get scurvy. That's where that word came from. And vitamin C and glucose compete with each other. When they go to the cell, there's a knock at the door. Insulin responds, looks at vitamin C and says, get out of here, and lets glucose in. There's your problem. That's the answer to the whole question. Nerves are destroyed. Bodies are destroyed. All these diseases are manifested by that. And in my opinion, every disease can be explained by that process. But you know what? Doesn't matter, because in my new book, I explain exactly how stem cells resolve all these issues.
Yeah, amazing. Wow. Okay, so much information here, and I wish we had more time, but I want to be very respectful of your time here. And you just mentioned, I think, a beautiful segue as we wrap up is your new book. Do you want to just share quickly with the audience, what to expect in this new book and where we can get it?
It'll be on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I'll ask by starting with the question, what does the word glucose mean? I was asked that question. I gave the answer I just gave you guys, but what does the word mean? It's a Greek word again. It means to adhere, to stick together. It's glue, glucose. So my new book at this point in time is going to be called Unglued. How do you get unglued? You use stem cells, but in Canada, it's illegal. Why is it illegal? Because it works. And it's safe. And Big Pharma doesn't want you to have it.
Is it legal in the States?
Okay,
that's a whole other conversation for another podcast, right?
Oh my God, yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've heard very little about stem cell. I know so many people having such success in healing various ailments using stem cell therapy.
It works on anything. Everything we talked about, it works on. Autism,
Amazing.
Alzheimer's. We didn't talk about autism. That's a national disgrace
Yeah.
in Canada as well as the United States.
Yeah.
So, yes, we'll have that's really what the book's about.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, when the book comes out, we'll have you back and we can dive more into that. Of course, everybody go and get the book. So when are we expecting it to be launched? Do you have an idea yet?
I think probably in about 6 weeks. I had to revise the book because of the FDA. They have very specific laws, 351, 361. It's a whole nonsense. They will make sure it's safe. FDA, Food and Drug Administration. The food is poison. You allow that, and here's the cure, and you want it to be safe. I've been using it for 15 years. 15 years. Now they tell me it's a drug. I'll leave you with this last thought, anthropology. If it is illegal and it's a drug, amniotic tissue, which is part of this equation, then Lucy was a drug dealer. Yeah. And every pregnant woman is a mule. So we'll explain and unveil and unglue that story in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, amazing. I love that. It reminds me of I was at a conference this weekend and they were talking about like how can nature be illegal? Like, do we not have a legal right to things in nature and in our own bodies? I mean, I know stem cells are like, they're already here, right? How is that illegal? Like it blows our mind, right? But
we have
a right.
We do. We have a sovereign right. It's called the Bill of Rights in the United States. I don't know what you have in your Constitution, but we have the Bill of Rights. I don't know when that was taken away. Yeah. It's a sovereign right. It's an inalienable right. Yeah. This discussion that you are having and many other podcasts are having, we are facing a tsunami of disease, and we are going to be wiped out by this. And that's another whole conversation, why this is going on. I have some thoughts on that with a third book that I have coming out. but that is way too much for this conversation.
Amazing. Yes, way too much. And no doubt we definitely need to have you back. So excited about the book. I'll make sure that the links for maybe pre-ordering are below in the show notes, and we can all, dive into that with you. And I'm excited to read it myself and dive into continue learning. And we'll get you back on the show when it launches and help promote that and have more of a conversation. I think here we're touching on some bigger pieces that we don't have time for today.
Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Jacoby, and thank you everyone for tuning into another episode. I hope that you got a lot out of this. This is probably an episode you're going to have to listen to a few times, letting this sink in and really wrapping your head around, all of the incredible information and viewpoints that you've shared with us. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you on the next episode, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. If you're loving what we talked about today, please remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone you love. And if you're ready to dive deeper into discovering your root causes and patterns that are keeping you hooked on sugar, be sure to check out our brand new free workshop series that will help you kick emotional eating for good. Find the link to download this free series and other amazing resources in the show notes below.